Good afternoon, and welcome to this session about building a private cloud. The session is called Inside the Lab, which means that some of the things that I will discuss may or may not be suitable for production. You have to decide that. Everything is going to be supported, though, kind of, anyway. It's about building your own private cloud infrastructure. And I've done this session a couple of times, and there's always someone saying, you know, I thought it was about Azure or Azure. Nope. Doesn't say anything about Azure on the screen here. Azure is the web service you can rent from Microsoft. I thought it was about developing application. Nope. Not a developer. Not going to develop anything at all. Best thing I can develop is a web page that says, hello world. If I can Google first, or sorry, Bing for it. Otherwise, I'm pretty lousy on that. I live in Sweden. I have an office. I've seen my office twice this year. I don't have any desk anymore. I used to have one, but now it's kind of gone. I work with deployment. I do virtualization, and I also help customers with standard Windows, Microsoft infrastructure. You know the stuff. I work as a consultant, speaker, and trainer. Happily, I'm an MVP in setup and deployment, which means that we are going to cover some part that has to do with deploying the stuff. The reason behind this session was someone asked me, you know, I like the private cloud thing. How do you build one? Why don't you submit a session about that? So I did, and here I am. We will cover Hyper-V. We will cover System Center Virtual Machine Manager. We will not cover the latest and the greatest version of System Center Virtual Machine Manager because that is not something you can use today. So I will cover something you can actually use today. That means System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008 R2. We're going to talk about iSCSI, because when you play and when you do lab, iSCSI seem to be one of the things you can afford. I remember the first time I went up to my CEO and say, hey, I want to play with Cluster. And he goes like, yeah, you know, Cluster is nice. How much does it cost? About $30,000. And at that moment, my Cluster dreams were gone. With iSCSI, you can download Microsoft iSCSI server for nothing. And then you have your SAN solution. We're going to talk about the self-service portals, we're going to talk about deployment, and we're going to talk about management. What you need to begin with is some kind of infrastructure to make this work, and you do need Active Directory. Don't try to build something that has to do with Hyper-V, cluster, management without Active Directory. Now, one of the most common issues I see when people start playing with this and trying to build things is that they really think virtualization is good for everything. So they P2V their old domain controllers into the cluster solution that depends on the same domain controllers. And then something happens. And then they call me in pure panic. It's like, Mike, you need to come now. I had that as a punchline, as a joke, but it turns out it happens to me for friends and customers I have about 1 to 2 times every year. So please run your domain controller that controls your private cloud on a physical machine. Even run it on a laptop. I don't care, as long as it's a thing. If you really, really need to virtualize that, do 1+1 virtualization, meaning you install a dedicated server with Hyper-V, and on top of that, a domain controller. Because you're really going to need that. So you're going to need to have that. You also need some kind of deployment solution. At least 2 people in this room knows that you can't install anything without a deployment solution. Yeah. And you really need to have that. Why is that? Well, if I'm going to build a private cloud, most likely I'm going to play with it before I figure out exactly how I would like to have this. When I start using it, it's going to be very important. And disaster happens. And then I need to reinstall things when things really go bad. And at that time, being forced to search for some document somewhere and try to figure out how did I do this the last time is not really going to work. Worst case so far for disaster recovery was a SharePoint solution, about 5 different servers. Everything went really bad. The documentation for disaster recovery was stored in I even seen customers doing a backup from one part of the SAN to the same SAN. How do you think that will work? Well, so you do need some kind of deployment solution. Well, if we are doing some kind of lab and we want to play with things, I don't expect you to spend like a week building a deployment solution. You would most likely want to have something that works in less than an hour, right? Something quickie, something that just works. You can do DVD with unattended XML files to install operating system. Not really a good thing. You can also use Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, which is a good choice. You can also use System Center Configuration Manager. But if you don't know System Center Configuration Manager, it's going to take you forever to figure out that. And it's pretty large just to deploy an operating system. I prefer something else for some strange reason. Let me see if I can touch my machine here. This way. Hopefully I can. I can't. That depends. It needs to be started before you can attach to it. And it's still starting. When I initially started doing this demo environment, I actually did it back home in our own data center. But I wasn't really sure that the internet connectivity would be perfect just the day I was supposed to do this demo. So I decided to run my private cloud on the HP EliteBook 8540. So this is the cloud you see here. Very slick and very portable, but anyway. So Microsoft Deployment Toolkit is a free download. It does require basically one thing. It requires some kind of file share, and it requires Windows Automated Installation Kit. Everything is free. You just download it. You install it using the famous next, next, next until finished. No reason to modify anything at all. When you've done that, you create a deployment share. And that is also a next, 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 and you're done, right? When that is done, you will have something that looks like this. That's a deployment share. That is a shared folder, very advanced. It's a folder that is shared on this machine, nothing else. Now, the only thing you need to do is to add operating system. You can create folders if you like, and then you right-click and say Import Operating System. You point to whatever location you have the operating system, which is, in my case, most likely to be the DVD. You go next, 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 next. Takes about 2.5 minutes, and then you have the operating system. The first machines we're supposed to deploy is most likely to be the what? Should we start with the Hyper-V machines? Should we start with the System Center Virtual Machine Manager? Depends. If you are going to use System Center Virtual Machine Manager, that is the first server you should install. Most customers so far I've been visiting has been doing it the opposite around. They first install all the Hyper-V hosts, create all the clusters, set up the shared storage, create everything. They create all the virtual machines, and then, in the end, they install System Center Virtual Machine Manager. The application that does all that, they already done manually. So please start with System Center Virtual Machine Manager, and that's going to be a generic server. So we're going to most likely need two task sequences. One sequence that creates and installs a standard server, and one sequence that installs a Hyper-V host with all the configuration we need. So task sequences, OS installed, new sequence. I give it an ID and a name. Windows Server 2008, sorry. That's a new version. 12 x64, generic. Also need to have the right keyboard, I see. Sorry, and this. And that's going to be something called the standard server task sequence. These are already made, so you just use them, and you specify the operating system. And I'm going to use the server enterprise just because it's funny. I don't specify the administrative password. I could do that and go next, and next, and hey, I have a task sequence. And this task sequence will what? Well, it will verify a couple of things. It gathers some information. It will validate the machine works. And it will go to the pre-install, and it will format and partition the hard drive. It's going to inject drivers, apply patches, it's going to install the operating system, blah, 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 blah. So that's going to be fine. That's a generic server. We install that, and we're done. But now maybe we would like to have a Hyper-V server. So let's create another task sequence called same thing. Sorry. Windows Server 2008 R2 x64 Hyper-V host. And we're going to pick the same sequence and go through the whole thing again. Maybe you should run core. Well, that depends. If I ask a Microsoft employee, should you use Hyper-V and run that on core server, they will absolutely say, yeah, you should absolutely use core server. But I say it depends. I have some customers, I would say, doesn't really manage to understand how a core server works. They can't really log on to a core server and do things in a core server. They don't have the knowledge about core server. If you don't have the knowledge about core server, you shouldn't use core server until you have learned core server. Microsoft claims that it's a much better security in core server. It is. It has a much lower impact, and security is better. From whom? Is it better from the network? No. Core server is better to protect itself from the administrator, because you can't mess it up. You need to know how to mess it up. And then if you know, then you don't do it, right? I mean, I've been to customers that actually sits on a domain controller and check the email. So what are you doing? I'm just browsing, nothing to do, going to run some Windows update. So you're on the domain controller, log on as a domain administrator, you're browsing the internet. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that works. But So I think I've seen it all. I'm getting old. I've seen worse, trust me. Can I reboot this domain controller? No, it's in use. Yeah, I know that, but you have a second run. Yeah, but this one is running Office as a terminal server for the office in Germany. Just checking. So you pop it up and say Properties, Task Sequence. What do we need on a Hyper-V host? Well, we need Hyper-V, right? If you want to use iSCSI, and you're also going to use multipath I/O, you're going to use multipath I/O. If you want to set up a failover cluster, you need a failover cluster component. If you're going to use some management software, you might need SNMP, right? There's a bunch of things we need. Let's add that. Under Tattoo, we go to Roles, Install Roles and Features, and specify what we need to have. Oh, there's Hyper-V. We're going to need that. We're also going to need failover cluster. We're also going to need multipath I/O. And we might just need SNMP. And you might add other things that you need for your server. So I just check the things that I need, and then I'm done. The task sequence is ready. And you can create other different task sequences for other things like web servers and SQL servers. And everything is automated. Would you like to add applications? Well, go ahead, add applications. Make the applications be installed too. It's just about task sequences. Maybe you need something else. It might need to run a command or BIOS upgrade or firmware upgrade or, I don't know, storage configuration, fixing disks, whatever you need, you can add that as tasks in the task sequence. When you're done with this part, it doesn't really work until you do something called an update deployment share. Update deployment share will generate WIM files and ISO images. And if you have a WDS server on the network, import the WIM file to that. Then you can go to your host machine, press F12, select the Hyper-V task sequence, and it's going to be a Hyper-V host joined into the domain. Now, this is going to be wizard-based, so you're going to need to fill out a form every time you install a server. And if you don't like that, well, you can pre-configure everything and say, this machine with this MAC address should have the following name joined to that domain, blah, 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 and so on. Which means that if I really do that, if my Hyper-V host fails and I need to reinstall it, the only thing I need to do at that time is what? F12, no questions asked. It's going to be exactly the same server as it used to be just a couple of minutes before that. I have this in place. I run my own lab, and I have my own Hyper-V environment. Recently, we had a Service Pack 1 coming out, right? It takes about, just, roughly, about 45 minutes to 1 hour to apply the Service Pack. It takes about 35 minutes to wipe the machine and reinstall it with the operating system. On my 45 nodes, I didn't install Service Pack 1. I did a wipe and load of everything instead because that's faster and it's more reliable. Since the operating system is already included with Service Pack 1, there's no problem with that, right? And I also got all the Hyper-V hosts reinstalled, which is pretty neat. There are some properties. You can deselect 32-bit because you're not going to use that. There is a rules file that you can play with. But I'm not going to cover this more right now. And the reason is we're going to come back a bit later And if you really want to know how to deploy servers using Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, there is a session on Thursday afternoon where we'll cover this in more detail. Flip. So you also need shared storage. To be honest, there's three things you need to have. You need shared storage, you need virtual network, VLANs, and you need VM virtualization. If you have two of these, you will be having some problems and issues. If you don't have shared storage, moving machines from one host to another host is going to be a painful process. It works, right? It works. Just takes forever. I'm going to move this 350 gig file over bits on a gig network. Start Monday morning, finish Wednesday afternoon, the week after, or something like that. If you don't have VLANs, it's going to be really ugly too, because then you're going to be forced to have a bunch of network adapters in every host. And you need to connect them to a massive amount of connectors. You're going to have cabling issues, so please use VLANs. And when I come to customers, they go like, oh, we don't use VLANs, it's too complicated. No, it's not that complicated. Well, it's too expensive. No, it's not that expensive either. Every switch that has been created last, I don't know, 10 years, basically have VLANs, and it takes about 5 minutes to figure it out. There's no training on that even. We need shared storage to be able to use cluster shared volumes, otherwise it doesn't work. We can have either Fiber Channel or iSCSI or SAS disks. I prefer to have either Fiber Channel or iSCSI. It's a bit more flexible, it's using the network, and you can cheat pretty much with whatever you do. Now there is actually a download from Microsoft that is called Microsoft iSCSI Target Server 3.3, which is a free download recently. I think it's a month ago something they released that, and that works really nice. They use VHD files, things like that, but I don't have any issues with it. It has only one problem. If you're building a test lab, you can't connect to yourself. And if you really want to play with this and build it on a laptop, you can't use it, because then you're going to need another machine, because you can not connect to yourself. However, there is another vendor out there called Starwind. It's also a free download. You need to pay for the fancy version with clustering and replication and things like that. But if you just need iSCSI, you can download this and turn any Windows XP into a storage. Just bang it with disks and you're done. And it's not that difficult to work with. The default password is Starwind. Took me 5 seconds to figure out. I didn't read the manual from the first time. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much. It looks like this. And in this, you add target. One of the issues I have with iSCSI is the naming they have. What's a target? Is that a server? Nope. A target is a disk. Oh, I thought that was a logical unit, a LUN. Well, it will become a LUN in the other end on the client side, but on the server side, we call it a target, okay? You give it a name. Disk, whatever, 3. And you select the hard disk, and you can use physical drives, but I prefer to play with virtual disks. And it could be a RAM disk, very fast, but it does require some RAM to make it worth the money. And I create a new one. And I put it somewhere. Maybe here. On disk 1.img. Pick your size. And if you do play with this, you're actually going to need some storage to be able to play with this. Let's say that you want to play with shared storage volumes, cluster shared volumes. You want to have like 2 or 3 VMs up and running, something like that, just for playing with it, or even more. But you're going to need about 10 to 15 gigs for each and every machine. So it is possible to run this in a really small lab environment. If you just have like, I don't know, half terabyte of drive, that will be perfectly fine running everything on. For production, you're going to need pretty much more. There's one thing that is important, and people who didn't really do this before tend to miss this one. And I get calls, emails, Twitters, whatever people use to communicate with. It's like, it works on the first node. Does it work on the other one? No. You missed one step. By default, most shared storage solutions only allow one machine to attach to that particular storage. If you need more machines than one, then you somewhere in the whatever storage application you have need to select allow concurrent connections. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So in this case, I need to check that one. Wasn't that hard to create the drive, right? So how do we do it on the client side? There are 2 ways, and here's why I encourage you to think twice before you do the core server. If you do the GUI server, you fire up this application. Start. iSCSI. I'm going to disconnect that one and remove that one. And then you type in your IP address or whatever you have. Host 2, quick connect. You can find it. Let me see. Config, let me see. I think I have an IP address. Oh, sorry, it's called host 02. It's pretty bad when you can't remember your own machine's name, right? Here's my disks. The difference between Microsoft iSCSI Target and StarWind is that Microsoft provide all the disks in one connection. StarWind provide each disks in one separate connection. Has nothing to do with performance. It's just a different way of providing that kind of information. But here they are, so let's go connect, and I'm done. Now, if I go into the server manager, and of course there's 2 ways of doing this. In server manager, I will have these disks, and I just need to online the disks, and I need to format and partition the drives, and then I'm done. So how should I format these disks? Let's say I format that drive. Let's say new simple volume. So what size should I have on my clusters in the file system? Sorry? Depends on the storage system. Well, that's when you do the RAID, then it depends on the storage system. This is the file system. You're going to store one large file, or maybe 2 or 3 large files. Would you like the operating system to read the sectors by 4K or 64 Ks. 64, right? You're not going to lose any space anyway. You're going to waste, worst case, like 60 K per file, but you're going to minimize the amount of reads you need to perform to be able to read a file. So when you use VHD storage, or as VHD storage, you flip to 64K immediately. And then you're done. Now, that is how you do it in GUI, and there's always someone that says, oh, I'm going to do that in Core. Okay, so how do you do that in Core? Well, you're going to need to have disk part. That's fine. List disk. Here they are. Okay. And I can see disk number 3 is offline. So, select disk number 3. I need to be able to type. Is there training for that? And I've selected disk number 3. So let's do online. Online disk. Yeah, it's online. Okay. So now I need to create a partition and format it, right? Create. Help. Create. Partition. I can't type. Partition. Okay. Primary. Oh, here it is. Create partition, primary size, blah, blah, blah. That seems good. And you should, of course, specify the size when you do it. So, create partition, primary, and it's write protected. How many of you have seen this? Pretty funny. I didn't know it could be write protected. But it's not write protected. It's just the issue of not having a signature on the disk. So we need to add a signature on the disk, and the only way to do that is to change an attribute of it. And the attribute is it set? I can't remember. Attribute setter. Boot this disk. Attributes disk. As you can see, it's read-only. And you need to set the attributes disk clear read-only to make that happen. Now, we can create the primary partition, and then we, of course, can format the drive and so on. So this is not that difficult. The problem is that if you're in a core server, you only use iSCSI, you have to use something called iSCSI CLI, which is a command line version of the iSCSI initiator. And iSCSI CLI iSCSI CLI is a horrible command. Everything is fine until the actual connect and make it persistent. Because the only way to do that is to type in all the parameters you need to have. And everything is going to be default, but you can't use default without typing in default. And the default is represented by a star. You're going to need 15 stars in a row with a space between. Trust me, you do it wrong every time. So when you finally find out how to type that, copy, paste it in a Notepad document, and that's the only way. So it's pretty messy to do this. It is possible, of course, to use iSCSI initiator that is hardware-based, which means that you have a dedicated network adapter that has this functionality inside itself, and that makes it a bit easier, but still it's going to need some kind of manual connectivity to make that happen. So you also need shared storage, and that's done, and setting up a failover cluster. I guess there's like 400 videos on the internet and explains how to do a failover cluster in Hyper-V nowadays, so that's not something we want to cover because it's so easy. We do need some kind of management. And one of the purposes of having a private cloud is to avoid all kind of work for me. I would like the users to consume resources I have. And I can look back in the time of my life, we had something called a webmaster. You remember the webmaster? That was a really nasty guy. Every time you need to update a document on the intranet site, you were forced to send a, please, do you mind change the text on the following page? And the reply was, maybe when I have the time. Now we don't have the webmaster. Instead, we have the guys working on the networking side, or we have the guys working on the storage side. They behave pretty much the same. I'm not sure why. And I behave the same too, because when my users, which are other techies, say, I would like to have a VM, I know how to create a VM. It takes me 5 minutes to do that. But I don't have the time right now. I don't really have time right now. So I send me an email, I will fix it as fast as possible. And I went through my mail a couple of years ago, and my personal response time is about 1 month. Now I'm the nasty webmaster anyway. I mean, send me an email. And we can't really do that automation just using Hyper-V Manager. We need something else to have that. We need templates, we need to move around machines, we need to be able to play with stuff. You might need PowerShell scripting, and there is 2 ways, and one that is real, and that is to use System Center Virtual Machine Manager. My approach is very simple. If you do have more than one host machine, you need System Center Virtual Machine Manager. There's no question about that. But you also might want to have a PowerShell library for Hyper-V, especially when you're playing around with stuff. Has anybody tried to script Hyper-V things? Is it easy? Yeah, you can use scripts, no problem. It's an object you need to play with, but it's not really decent. Anybody tried the PowerShell library from Codeplex? It works really nice, right? So with PowerShell library for Hyper-V, which is a free download from Codeplex, we actually get some kind of decent, I want to create machines, and that's 4 lines of code, and nothing else, right? So when I build machines, I use not System Center Virtual Machine Manager on my laptop because that's messy, but I use the PowerShell library. And I just want to show you some simple scripts for this. Tools, PS. Here we have one machine. Oh, here it is. Starts with a block of parameters, some information. It loads the module, and when the PowerShell module is loaded, we can suddenly start using PowerShell. That is a script that is command line based, creates a machine based upon a reference image, which means that if I need to create a machine for testing and playing in a lab environment, it takes me about 2 minutes to build a machine, to log on. Right? If I want to create a big infrastructure, 10 different servers, takes me about an hour. I never build my demo environment before I come to TechEd. I build them at TechEd, because I want to be sure that I have the latest and the greatest, and everything works, things like that. So it doesn't really have anything to do with private cloud, but it's just a very smart thing to play with. And it can be used. If you do core server, I strongly recommend you to install the PowerShell library on those core servers. If anything fails, you can use the PowerShell components to start, stop machines without doing it from another machine. Maybe there's network connectivity issues, you can't connect to that machine, and you have 4 VMs running. You don't really want to power off that machine. Oh, if you just shut it down, the machines will be in safe state. Well, yeah, at least they should. So, here's the... Since I added parameters to this, I just need to type in my locations where to store things like this. Source, that is the sysprept VHD file, which I have in this folder, so just pick one. Say I want to base it on a Windows Server 2008 R2X64 Service Pack 1. Sorry, that was not my intention. I also want to have in ISO mounted. I want to have the C:\Windows System 32 VM guest ISO. And I also want to set the MAC address to 0015, 00, 01, 02, 03. Created. It's in here. It's going to start up, do the final configuration, reboot self, and then I can log on to my machine. Isn't that a pretty nice way of creating virtual machines? Or do you prefer the click, 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 insane clicking? I prefer this. I'm going to kill it. I get the point anyway. The more appropriate way is to use System Center Virtual Machine Manager. And if you do build a private cloud, this is something you really, really need to have. So let's fire that up. Installing System Center Virtual Machine Manager is pretty much a walk in the park, except for 2 things. Number 1, it asks you if you want to have it running as a local system or a user account. Please select a user account. Create a user account for System Center Virtual Machine Manager and use that. Please. Number 2, it asks you where to store the library files. Library files are ISO images, VHD files, stuff like that, right? It suggests to store them in C:\program data. Storing 500 gigs of ISO images and VHD files in C:\program data doesn't really make sense to me, so I always pick another location. Now, the most obvious question would, of course, be, can't you just move that folder if you did something wrong and installed it at the wrong location? No, you can't. That folder can't be moved. You can, however, create other storage location and store things there, but I prefer to put it on the right location immediately. Now we can do all kinds of stuff here. We can move things, stop machines, create new machines. But for the purpose of building a private cloud, one thing that you really need to spend time in is to create templates. Because templates is what's going to be used by the end user, or the developer, or the programmer, or the other IT guys. So we really need to have some kind of templates. And there are a couple of ways of doing this. One way is to say, well, I'm going to create one template for each and every role and each and every version I have of this. That works, but it's not really that great. So the first thing we do is that we go into the library. And in the library on the right side, you can see I have something called new template. Library. I have new template, new hardware profile, new guest operating system profile. And most likely, you're going to have one hardware profile for every faked physical configuration. I have 3 back home. One for the machines that are supposed to be on the internal network, one for machines that is supposed to go in the perimeter network, and 4 machines that goes to the lab network. It's the same network adapter, but they have different VLANs. In this case, I only have 1. And there are a couple of things you really need to fix in these templates. If you just create a template by doing next, System Center Virtual Machine Manager will create a template that is very compatible with everything, but it is designed to be as slow as possible and so unflexible as possible, and you don't really want that. So if I go to new hardware profile, demo, hardware, number 1, allow migration to virtual machine with host with different processors. That's very convenient. If you don't have that checked in, you can't move running machines between different versions of the same CPU family. And most likely, you would like to be able to move between 2 generations of Intel or 2 generations of AMD. The memory amount of 512 is not really the perfect amount of memory for running a domain controller, file server, or whatever server we have. It's just not enough. How much memory should you have on a virtual machine running Windows Server 2008 R2 that doesn't do anything at all? What is the minimum amount of memory in that case? 2 gig of RAM. If you have less, you're going to consume too much disk I/O. So you're going to bump it up to at least 2 gigs. Next up, one of the issues we have down here is that we only have one IDE. Hypervisor Windows Server 2008 R2 Hyper-V supports hot add storage, but only on SCSI disks. And they didn't put that in the template from the beginning, so you're going to start with adding the SCSI adapter. And every extra disk you're going to add to those machines are going to be put on that, because then you can hot add remove them while the machine is running. Otherwise, you need to turn them off. The network adapter is an emulated network adapter. You shouldn't use the emulated network adapter. You should use the synthetic network adapter. So you start with removing that and adding the synthetic network adapter. It has a lower impact on the host machine, performs better, it's faster, so there's no reason to have the legacy network adapter, unless you run an operating system that doesn't have integrated components. You run Linux, DOS, NT4, or something like that. Something really, really awkward, or just very old. Now you have a hardware profile. You also need to create a guest operating system profile. for the OS. And here, you really need to make sure you pick the right operating system. Depending on what you pick here, it's going to result in either creating XML files, unattended XML files, or it's going to create sysprep.inf files. In this case, it's going to be a sysprep.inf file, and that doesn't really work well with Windows Server 2008 R2. Don't ask me why they organized the 64-bit version as 64-bit over here, but someone had some fun anyway. You might want to specify it should be joined into the domain. In that case, you do that. And as a user, you should, of course, never, ever use this account. And here's another thing. You can set the time zone here, right? That's great. But you can't set other things like keyboard or other settings. Well, you can set them. You just need to have an answer file. And you can import answer files. And in this case, my answer file is setting a bunch of different settings together with keyboard for Swedish. Since I'm from Sweden, I prefer to have that keyboard. And you can also add some kind of run once command lines. And I'm going to come back to that later on. When you have that, you also need to have a disk. And here, you can see that I have a VHD file. That VHD file is created, you can create these reference images in two ways. The correct way is to create a task sequence in Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, boot the machine up, select sysprep and capture this machine, and then you get a WIM file. And then you can apply that WIM file to a VHD file. But it's kind of pointless since it already is a VHD file. So you can do the sysprep and capture. You just modify some steps in the task sequence so it doesn't do the capture part. It just turns off. And then you have a VHD file. That's great, right? How long does it take to create a machine, a VM? Installing a Windows Server? Half an hour? Would you say? Yeah, okay. Would you like to do it in less time? Okay. So here's the cheating way. There's a small script called vim2vhd, which will create a new VHD file by just applying the image in the installed Vim file. You can specify different things, like I want to merge that folder. I want to inject those patches. I want to use that unattended file, which means that you can pretty much configure everything without even installing Windows. So how long do you think it takes on my laptop here to create a brand new sysprepped VHD file? Anybody? It takes less than 3 minutes, which is pretty fast. So every time I have a new operating system, I download the ISI images, I mount the ISO images, and I create my new reference images, and I'm done. And it's not that hard to run either. You specify what Vim file you should use. Don't I have it on the G9? No, I didn't have it. There it is. If you just run it like this, it's going to say, hey, you need to specify which Vim file index in that Vim file you would like to have, /skew, : server enterprise. And you press enter, and it takes 2.5, 3 minutes to create one for you, and then you have a VHD file, and you just import that VHD file into System Center Virtual Machine Manager, and you do have a reference image. So that's pretty fast to do. Now, if you look here, you can see that I have created templates. One template for web machines, web servers, one that is generic, and one for SQL Server. But I only have one VHD file, and I actually only have one software configuration, a guest OS profile too. So if I open these up and check what's the difference between these machines, you can see that the run once command is different. This run once command does the following. First of all, in the VHD file, I set the auto log on to yes, automatically log on. If it's auto log on, it means that it's going to run these commands immediately. So the first thing the machine will do is to do an... Sorry? Yeah, I can't really show you that. I can show you that from another view, though. The command looks like this. It runs the light-touch VB script and specifies the skip task sequence, set what task sequence I should run, set deployment type to custom, and then I add something really awkward. I said vmmconfig : web. And that is something that doesn't exist. I just invented that. If we go back, we'll see the following things. In my VMM part here, I have something called a post-configuration task sequence for VMM deployment, and that contains the following. A task sequence with different sections. If I select vmmconfig : web, it will run this part, because I said that sequence only applies when vmmconfig = web. Means that I can have one VHD file, one sequence, one OS profile, one hardware profile, multiple templates, and when user then select to have a web template, they will get a standard OS that will add the web components at deployment time. If he selects the SQL, it's going to be the same image, but it's going to install SQL at runtime. That also means that if I modify my main VHD file to be a Service Pack 2, from that point on, every machine is installed as a Windows 2008 R2 x64 with Service Pack 2. That makes it easy for me. I don't need to do very much. I just need to figure out what kind of machines people would like to have. Of course, they're going to be forced to do some kind of tweaking, but not really much. Can you install SQL Server 2008 R2 unattended? Yeah, and it's pretty easy. And if you do it unattended, it's about half the time it takes to do the click, click, click. So how do you figure out how to do a SQL Server unattended installation? It's easy. Download the standard version of SQL Server 2008 R2. Fill out everything you want to fill out. Next, 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 next. In the end, it's going to say, I'm going to run this script. Open it in Notepad, save it on the desktop, and there's your script. It looks like I think I have it here. Yeah. Here's the SQL configuration file. Blah, 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 blah. So you just specify that. Which means that I can install everything, like SQL servers, web servers, I don't know, CRM servers. I have templates for basically everything. The users have no clue on how to do that, but I figured it out. Now, this gives me some joy, but it's not going to be perfect, because I still need to create these machines. It's going to be easier for me, right? The only thing I need to do to create a web server, and please, I just want to show you something really strange. You see, I'm selected a library here, and I select the generic, and I right-click, and I say New Virtual Machine, and I give it the name of Demo, and I just click Next, and Next. I'm sorry, I'm going back. You see the identify information here says Demo, which means that the machine will be called Demo, right? Nothing strange with that. Well, let's go to Hosts and select a New Virtual Machine. And I'm going to select a template. Same template. And Demo. And Next. And now you see it says Star. To be able to use the name you give the machine when you create the machine without typing it twice, you need to be in the library and right-click on the template. Otherwise, that function doesn't work. Is it a bug or a feature? Since it happens every time, I guess it's a feature. So now it's really easy for me, and I could use the System Center Virtual Machine Manager, of course, to create everything, but still I need to do that. I could add the Self-Service Portal 1.0 and let the users create stuff, but still I want to need to do a bunch of things to make that happen anyway. So I prefer to have a self-service portal. As much self-service as possible is very nice. And it's two ways. Either you have the 1.0 or you have the 2.0. You should have the 2.0. The 2.0 is a solution accelerator. You download it, doesn't cost you anything. You install it, takes about 10 minutes to set it up. If you do the next finish without any questions, it will work perfectly fine. There are others too. Let's check this out. Now the point with having, the big thing I would say, of having a self-service portal is that it looks pretty much different. And it works differently. Now, we can evolve everything in business logic. Someone needs to request to be able to build an infrastructure. They need to define what they're going to have. They're going to be charged for whatever resources they use, and they need to get everything approved. I, as the administrator, now have the luxury of saying, yep, nope, yep, nope. And I don't create machines anymore. I just approve things. So it starts with a request, and here the end user can create a business unit, HR, or, I don't know, money laundry department, or whatever they have. They call it a name, The code is demo, of course, sorry. Someone at Microsoft.com. We need to have some kind of justification. We can also specify who's going to be the administrator of this business unit. So, fine. As an administrator, I can go back and say, hey, there's a request for the business unit and they are onboarding. I want to improve them. So now they are improved. Now it's possible for them to say, I would like to have infrastructure. Priority. And I can also specify, I think this test environment, or this, whatever it's going to be, is going to be decommissioned next year. So I'm only going to use this for a period of time. I need to have some kind of business justification, otherwise I'm not allowed to do this. And I also say, well, I'm going to consume 16 gigs of RAM and not more than 200 gigs of storage. Now, when they specify this, they can't consume more than that. If they need to consume more, they need to fill in a change request that you need to approve. And if you feel for it, you say yes. Otherwise, you say no. Depends on the amount of whiskey you receive. So now they have an infrastructure, and it needs a service. So I'm going to select an environment to use. It's going to be demo stuff. Environment description, billing code. And that service is going to require, of course, a part of whatever I had. Let's say 4 gigs, and the storage is going to be 40 gigs. Now, that's what the customer needs to pay for. That's what's going to end up in the billing for him. He can also pick the network he would like to have. He can request other networks. He can define who and when and how. We can also use rapid provisioning. Can also add other things like a service role. And he does that too. So the service role is file servers. Going to be on that network. If he needs a load balancer, fine, he can request that too, and then he save and close everything. And to go next. And then he can say, well, I would like to have a generic server and a web server. And then he submits the request. I, as the administrator, can now see that, hey, here's a guy, he needs a bunch of things. No. He's not going to use the web server. No way, not going to allow that. Some service he needs to have. Let's check that out. Please be faster. I go through these and I specify, yes, that's okay, and you're going to be able to put the machines over here and things like that. It's just very slow for some reason. When everything is done, everything is approved, and the user he added to this portal now can go into the portal and say, hey, I want to have this. Here you can see I can specify like on the following host machines, blah, 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 blah. Oh, he needs a library. I'm going to assign a library for him. He's going to be able to use that library. He's going to be able to store his machine in the following library. Yeah, pretty much like that. Save. That's configured and done. File servers. Let's see, he needs something. No, he doesn't need anything. That's fine. And a machine here. Yeah, that's okay. He's going to be able to use that. Now we can go into virtual machines and say, I would like to create virtual machine. And then he can select his business unit and his infrastructure. If I go to internal IT, I have an infrastructure already done, select everything, and he can say, I would like to create 45 web servers. Start with the name of Web 1 and end with Web 24. And he's going to create all these machines for you. But I would like to create it individual. Demo 44. I'm going to apply that to that machine, specify the domain. If I want to have a static MAC address, I can do properties and check it out. Blah, blah, blah. I click create, and guess what's going to happen. Now, this is going to run sequences in Virtual Machine Manager, gets a MAC address for each and every machine, gets IP addresses if that is needed. Going to use that template, create that machine. And that template also uses Microsoft Deployment Toolkit to get even more information to finish up the configuration. And it takes about, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then the end user has the ability to say, here's my machines. And I don't do anything else than approve things. And I like to do that, being some kind of, the approval guy. You also need to have some kind of monitoring, and I'm really sorry I didn't really did the time calculation correctly, so I don't really have time to do monitoring, but you do need to have some kind of monitoring, and that's going to be Microsoft Operation Manager. You can also use System Center Essentials, but I would recommend you to use System Center Operation Manager. I don't have time to do that demo. I don't have time to tell you about the book either, but there's a book around deployment if you want to know more about that. There are other things, of course, you can use. Most important, please complete the evaluation form. And as Johan used to say, be honest but gentle. And I would like to thank you all for coming to this session. And if you do have any questions, I will now run down to the Technical Learning Center and be in the private cloud booth for the rest of the day. Thank you so much.